All right, so we are now on to topic two, which is sociological research here. And in this first video here, we're just going to get a general orientation to what sociological research is overall, and particularly distinguish it from other ways of knowing. But taking a look at all of the kind of learning outcomes and key terms for this topic. That's here on the screen. Remember, this is always on the read page or section for each week, and this week in particular here. And let's see, there's actually a third little bit here as well. So for this first part here, really for this chapter and this topic, there's only one box within the online textbook that you need to read because it contains a key concept for this topic, and that's this one here. It's the Making Connections box, the Hawthorne effect. And so there's more to the box than what's on the screen here, but make sure you definitely read that because this is, as we see here on our list of key concepts, somewhere here. Yeah, so there's the Hawthorne effect reactivity here, the first list there. Okay, so just as an introduction to what is sociological research, I actually really like the introduction that the online textbook has for this chapter, for this topic here. And so that's what's on the left-hand side of the screen here. This is just copy and pasted from there. It is an account of some words said by a former Canadian Prime Minister, that's Prime Minister Stephen Harper, in response to a very tragic event that happened in the US, the Boston Marathon bombing. What Little doesn't really sort of elaborate on is kind of how these comments specifically, this is not the time to commit sociology when trying to understand why two individuals committed this really horrific crime and this really horrific act at the Boston Marathon. But he was responding to questions put forth by other members of the Canadian government at that time. And so specifically, actually, Justin Trudeau, who at the time was a member of the opposition party, the Liberal Party, the leader of that party there. So I've included that here. But also here, there's a little bit more elaboration on his comments, Stephen Harper's comments here, and that I wanted you to see as well. And that's specifically, so when you see a violent act like a bombing, you don't sit around and try and rationalize it or make excuses for it or figure out its root causes. You condemn it, and you condemn it categorically, and to the extent you can deal with the perpetrators, you deal with them harshly as possible. So this is what he was meaning. He said, no, we got to punish the people that did this. We don't have to sit around and think about why they did it and the root causes, which he was attributing to sociology as a focus, which actually is what sociology does. But one thing I don't, which is interesting about, and it might just be because when Little wrote the online textbook here, he's using an American case here with the Boston Marathon bombing here in these comments. But this isn't actually the only time that Stephen Harper said to the public, no, don't commit sociology. So and they're actually Canadian examples and cases here. So later that year, or in that same year as the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, in Canada, there was a thwarted attempt by I believe it's two individuals who were planning on setting off a bomb on a train in, I believe, Ontario or Quebec, or a train that was running in or through both of those provinces there. And so, anyways, these two individuals thankfully were caught before they did anything. And as sort of news about this plot was being released, again, the prime minister at the time said that no, we have to charge these people and punish them. We're not doing sociology. Now is not the time to commit sociology. The other time, a year later, he had it out for sociology, I'm afraid, which sociologists really took to heart, I can tell you. But the other time that he said, no, this is not the time to commit sociology, was in response to the very tragic, murder of a teenage Indigenous girl in, I believe it was Winnipeg, Manitoba. Tina Fontaine had been assaulted and then murdered by two men. And again, in response to discovering her death and then dealing with the perpetrators there, Stephen Harper again said, no, this is not a sociological phenomenon. This is a crime problem. Let's deal with it as a crime. Now, as someone who teaches criminology from a sociological perspective, of course it's sociological in this respect here. Now, again, I still like how why, and I get why Little introduced the topic of sociological research with this example, and particularly these cautions by someone to not do sociology, because it really highlights why we need to do sociology. So again, copying from the online textbook here, Little says that in this framework of trying to deal with it, why someone would commit a horrific crime, a bombing, try to bomb a plane or a train or kill a young girl. Little says that in this framework, the terrorist or the criminal is a kind of person who's beyond reason and morality. That's what they seem to be. Like, how could someone do something so horrible? And therefore, what Stephen Harper was sort of implying was that therefore a sociological analysis is meaningless. It's futile, but it's also contrary to the utter determination through our laws and through our activities to do everything we can do to prevent, other future acts of terror or crimes. Little goes on to say that sociological research, though, this is what we do. It's especially important with respect to public policy debates about how do we deal with crime? How do we deal with the tragic and the ongoing problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada? How do we deal with the politics and the economics of international terrorist activities? These are public policy debates, and sociological research is needed to help inform our responses to these problems as we see them. I'm going to jump down to the last little comments here that Little makes then, is that posing a debate in terms of, it's not sociological, it's criminal. This, he says, narrows the range of options available and undermines our ability to raise questions about what responses to terror or what responses to crime actually work. And that's what sociological research does, is it finds us the answers to how do we stop crime? How do we prevent crime? How do we reduce crime? So we need to do this types of research, and we need to do and commit sociology in a very clear way. Okay, so in Brightspace, as your introductory check-in this week, I asked you to consider a couple of questions, and mainly in response to a claim such as this, that Albertans are bad drivers. So I hopefully you have already you've considered those particular questions that were posed there. I'm going to, follow up a couple of different places here on those questions here, and actually we're going to start with that here. So hopefully you have you're on one side or the other, that you agree Albertans are bad drivers, or no, you don't think Albertans are bad drivers. Now, I can't hear what your answer is. I want to know, but a question for you is, how do you know? How did you come to that sort of realization and that answer that yes, Albertans are bad drivers, or no, they're not? How do you know they are? What sort of things and information did you sort of, think about to try and, assess your level of agreement with the statement here? And I'll tell you, again, without hearing what they are, I'll put money on the fact that likely how you know or don't, or that the Albertans are bad drivers or not, is likely really good examples of the different ways of knowing something, or the different sources of knowledge about knowledge in our world here. So there's actually, around, there's different ways of knowing, there's different sources of knowledge. My formatting is all changed around here, so my apologies here. Um, so this table, ways of knowing and description, this is from the online textbook, and Little has a whole bunch of different ways of knowing here. He talks about casual observation, selective observation over generalization, authority, tradition, and scientific research methods. And he has a description of each of those there. I'm going to talk about these things. I'm going to call them a slightly different terms here. And I'm going to lump together some of these as well. So I'm going to take the first three things here, and I'm just going to talk about them in terms of personal experience. And going back to our Albertans bad drivers, you likely mostly use personal experience to answer that particular question. And so that's one source of knowledge. Other sources of knowledge are things like tradition or authority. So I'll talk about that here as well. And then lastly, there's scientific research methods, and obviously science is a third one there. So personal experience, and I'm staying on this slide. So personal experience is really just, as Little describes too, there's just observations that we make as we just go about our lives. So in the case of trying to agree or disagree whether Albertans are bad drivers, you riding around, seeing other drivers, watching other people driving, who might be driving you if you don't drive yet, in that respect. And so personal experience observations are just things we have discovered for ourselves, usually just by doing or experiencing things. And so, for instance, if I was asked to declare, do I agree or disagree with Albertans being bad drivers? I drive to work every day, and drive two ways, home and to work, and I see a lot of driving of other people. Some days it's good, some days no. I'm going to come down hard on the Albertans being bad drivers just because of the various rules that I see people breaking, how they negatively impact on my smooth commute into work, and so on. So personal experience is a source of knowledge. Tradition is another source of knowledge, and I'm dividing tradition and authority up here. Tradition is just the common sense that we talked about in previous classes. Common sense, tradition, this is the kind of knowledge that is passed down from one generation to another, from parents to children, from other community members to community members. So it's things like anything that, that's the way it's always been. This is the way that it always has been, and that's tradition. So I'll give you an example. You may have tradition within your, your list of, how you came to decide on this discussion. For me, I grew up in British Columbia as a child, and I had two parents, and various times driving with one or both, or they were driving, one or both of them were driving me. And I remember actually encountering, because we lived actually in a small community that was kind of a summer resort town, so to speak. And actually a lot of Albertans came, and were tourists and vacationers there in the summer. So I remember hearing family members and my family members talking to friends and complaining about how bad Alberta drivers were. Alberta drivers came from the prairies, so they only knew how to drive on straight lines. They didn't know how to handle the mountains and curves in the roads in BC. So tradition, that for me, is a traditional source of knowledge, because that, I grew up hearing that, of course, Albertans are bad drivers, because that's just the way it is. Authority is another source of knowledge. This is knowledge given to us by others, or sorry, by experts. Certain people in our society have the skill and the knowledge, expertise that we trust. So when they tell us something is true, we take that as truth, because they're the experts, they're the authority on that. So in this particular case here, I'll give you a couple of examples of who might potentially be authority on whether or not Albertans are bad drivers. This is a little excerpt from I think a frequently asked question document just after Alberta introduced distracted driving legislation. And this was, I think, back in the 2000s, in the mid 2000s here. They implemented the laws that, you can't be on your phone or otherwise be distracted. And so in this one question and answer here, we see the government sort of justifying and rationalizing that, I guess, some Albertans are bad drivers because they're on their phone or they're doing other things that are distracting them while they're driving. So they felt it important to enact a law to punish people doing that. So that's government is, in some cases, a source of authority knowledge. Another source, in particular when we're talking about driving, would be police and other law enforcement. And so I grabbed this article recently, January here, 2026, and it was interesting, the police sort of coming out, and I don't actually remember hearing this, seeing something like this before in previous years, but apparently fatal collisions, car collisions across Alberta were significantly on the rise throughout December 2025. And the authority in this particular case, they sort of made this sort of press release, news release, just to try and maybe remind us that we need to be more careful. And if we didn't need to be reminded, that sort of means maybe some of us aren't doing our best at driving. So another example of an authority source there. Now, go back to here. So tradition, authority, observation, or personal experience is definitely our common ways of knowing that we rely upon. The last one is science, or scientific research. Knowledge is another really important source of knowledge in the ways that we know things. And so science, or the scientific way of knowing things, it involves controlled, systematic observations of the social world. Scientific knowledge rests on, sorry, I should, okay, I'm going to jump ahead here. Sorry, my slides are all out of place here. So here's the definition of scientific knowledge, then I'll give you an example. So scientific way of knowing involves controlled, systematic observations of the world. It relies upon empirical evidence, meaning information we can verify with our senses. We can see it, for example. Yeah, and so I'll come back and elaborate a little bit more on this definition here, but let me give you an example to our driving, our Albertans bad drivers. So there's arguably, I don't think anyone has done any research, saying, whether or not Albertans are worse drivers than, say, BC drivers here. But I actually did find, a scientific journal article. I did just a quick search, and someone has done a study, factors underpinning unsafe driving, and they, took a look at sort of what might be some of the things that contribute to, bad driving. And so this study is scientific. If we wanted to really explore and study, whether or not Albertans truly are bad drivers, we could probably take some of what they learned in this study and see if, Albertans kind of hit on the different things that, make bad drivers in that way. All right, so with our different sources of knowledge, all are valid sources of understanding and knowing about the world. You are going to likely rely on more than one source. It's rare that you just rely on personal experience, for example. And you may have to rely on more than one source of knowledge these days, particularly now that we're living in this information age where, we have access to more and more information via the internet. We have quantity of information, the quality of that information we're exposed to is often in question. You think about fake news and conspiracy theories and all that sort of stuff. So we often actually need more than one source of knowledge to really kind of get a sense of really what's going on and verifying information. But unfortunately, we do often end up with conflict or differences between different sources of information and disagreements between these various sources of knowing about the world. One source of knowledge may conflict with another. So for example, your personal experience, maybe you've never seen anyone do anything bad driving, and so you think, oh, of course, no, Albertans are good drivers. But, as we see, police might say, no, there are very bad, drivers out there. We're seeing an increase in deaths, and so there could be disagreement and differences there. And so some of these, apart from science, they are, they're problematic in many different ways. So it's scientific knowledge that attempts to sort through any differences or disagreements, and to settle any differences of opinion or common sense. And it's through science that this can be possible. So scientific knowledge helps us to move beyond guesswork and common sense and those sort of different accounts from different sources to help us understand the hows and the whys of human social interaction. Because it's science, it's sociological knowledge must be gained through research that's conducted in an organized manner that is recognized by others. Doing science is a very public venture. Your methods must be open and judged by others. Your results have to be shared with others, no matter whether you proved what you were setting out to prove, so that you have to share your results with others so others can assess the worth and the value of your research. There's a form of constant scientific scrutiny of knowledge gained through science, such that there's like a quality control mechanism. If you do bad research, your colleagues and other scientists are going to call you out on it and make it known that you're doing bad science and your knowledge should not count. So science also has a built-in mechanism for self-correction. Social scientific research does not purport to produce eternal truths or the truth that, they find something and this is going to always and forever be the truth. And that just doesn't happen. What is accepted as scientific truth changes over time as more and more evidence is collected. And it just makes sense because society is always changing. So of course our knowledge and understanding is going to change. So this means that scientific knowledge will change. It's harder to change understandings based on tradition or authority or even personal experience and observation. If people don't see it or experience it for themselves, it's hard for them to sort of expand and grow. Finally, a last characteristic of science, as a science, sociology strives to be objective. Scientists try to ensure that their biases, their values, their personal opinions do not affect their research, either in the reporting of their data or in the interpretation of the results that they get. So they do try to, be, objective in that way. So objectivity in research, is depends upon careful adherence to the scientific rules and procedure that are set out, the rules of conducting science there, and the process that is widely accepted as scientific research methods there. So with that, in the next video and in the readings, we'll cover some of that research process and how researchers go about studying and gathering all of this empirical evidence.